I recently did a BIOS chip swap on a hard drive printed circuit board, and I got some tutorials on YouTube, and the technicians in there were using wicking to clean up the contact points to get the solder off. If you've seen that wick, it's just called Solder Wick, and it's kind of a flexible copper, sort of almost like big dental floss sort of thing, and it's meant to soak up the solder. And I didn't have any of that, and so what I did was made a couple versions out of some stranded copper wire. Now this is pretty heavy gauge. I'm guessing probably 12 or 14 or something. So you can see that I flattened this out and made sort of like a wick brush out of it. And then this one I made sort of like a pick, a wick pick. And then it's got this little tinier side over here. So I cut some of the strands of copper off there. So the way that I use this was, this is the donor board, by the way, so you can see I already put the other one in, but so I noticed in the video that the guys are pressing the wick material down into the the area to be cleaned with their soldering iron, which makes sense. And so I was getting kind of nervous about the pressure and the heat and stuff, and so I was glad I kind of did this. The insulation on the wire really helps sort of keep it on the warm rather than hot side, if you know what I mean. So as soon as you start using the soldering iron on the copper, it got hot, and I'm guessing that's probably where the wick material does a little better. As I've used it, it doesn't remember getting that hot, but I like the firmness, and I saw the videos and I'm like, man, it just seemed like that wick was real flexible and almost too flexible. So I used this as a brush, and I pressed, you just imagine my right hand holding a soldering iron instead of a video camera. Pressed it in there, and it just drew that solder right up on in here into this brush, and cleaned everything up really super well, super nice. And I like the stability of this. It's kind of flexible a little bit, obviously. It's just wire. So again, if you had a lighter gauge wire, it would probably work too. You could try it, because the finer the strands, probably the better. But for me, at 300 degrees on my soldering iron, this was just right. So I'm thinking that a little bit lighter gauge, maybe like a 16 or an 18 would work fine too. And the extra, just that extra fineness of the strands of copper might make it a little bit more delicate and a little bit more just clean, I suppose. But anyway, in this, using this little chip here as an example of what I had to deal with, and the reason that I made this sort of this little pick here is because I needed some real target sort of wicking here, because I used flux and everything the way the tutorials recommend, but I had some solder overlap, like, sorry about that, right here. So there was some solder overlap between these two legs, and I didn't want to take it apart. So so what I did is I made this one here, and what I did is I took my soldering iron, because there was lead, solder, I mean, right here, and so I put my soldering iron right up against that little tip of that wick there, and it really just drew that in there. And as it was doing that, I kind of sort of did a little flicking motion here, and it cleaned that solder right out of there really nicely. And so I was like, wow, that's great. And then I also noticed there's a little bit of extra solder here. It was kind of a little sloppy looking. So what I did is I pressed my little tip of this wick pick right up against this leg here, this little contact point, and you put the soldering iron there, and it just drew that little bit of extra solder right up into that wick. I did it to this one and this one. I just kind of cleaned it up a little bit with this thing. It really worked good. So if you need to do something and you've got some of this extra wire laying around and you don't have any of the wicking material, then I certainly recommend making like a little, sort of like a little wicking brush here with this, and these little, you can see how if you need to get into a tight spot, you don't have to deal with that wick material that's readily available. You can make your own. It'll get right in there, and just press it in there, and then press your soldering iron right up against that. I guess they have those torches too, and I didn't have that blowtorch, and I guess that would really work just great for this too, because everything would just get drawn right up into this copper here. The solder would just go right up in there. But anyway, I hope it works for you. This is the only example of soldering I happen to have, but you can see that these chips are pretty small and it worked great for these. So any larger areas, I'm sure it'll work even better. So good luck, have fun.